international documents approved without having them ratified by every nation. There is an effort in the US to say that because we already have the existing international health regulations, that the amendments will not need to be approved by the Senate, and such an effort is probably going on in your countries too. The same is probably true of the Pandemic Accord, which is why its name keeps changing. So I've just mentioned some of there's a lot more really terrible provisions in these two documents. We have draft copies. We don't have the final copy yet. But the World Health Assembly, which is all the 194 nations in the WHO, will be meeting in May, and we'll be discussing the final versions. And within the next month or so, we should have final versions, but they may not be in the public domain at that time. Okay, so the current health regulations has language which says the implementation of these regulations shall be with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. That language has been removed from the new version. So human rights and fundamental freedoms were taken out, as well as dignity. These are words that have real legal meanings. This is very critical. Before the IHRs were recommendations, now they are binding. They are to be enforced, and countries need to create enforcement mechanisms. There is also to be enforced surveillance of people and of microorganisms, enforced censorship, enforced single narrative, harmonization of regulation of vaccines and drugs. So if you thought the way our vaccines and drugs are being regulated now and checking for safety and efficacy, they're trying to make that process pretty much go away, and we will harmonize this so that Zimbabwe will have the same level of drug regulation as Sweden. The liability will go away for all of these products. And so when will these documents come into force? When the Director General of WHO issues a declaration that there is a public health emergency of international concern. All that means is you can have a new virus that is in multiple countries. It doesn't specify the severity. You don't have to have deaths. But the Director General can call an emergency, and then all these things then start functioning, and the Director General gets extraordinary powers. He doesn't even need an emergency. He needs a risk of a potential emergency, and his powers can be continued after the emergency has been contained. The WHO budget would jump from under $4 billion a year to an estimated $60 billion a year, with a build-out for this whole pandemic planning apparatus of probably between $100 and $200 billion over a period of 5 years. The way WHO, the method through which it can gain control of virtually everything in the world, and not just your health, is through a fabricated concept called One Health, which really doesn't have any meaning. What it says is that the health of people cannot be looked at in isolation, but you must also consider livestock and wild animals, because diseases can be transmitted between them and humans, and antibiotic resistance can be transmitted between animals and humans, or between the meat we eat and humans. But animals isn't enough. We can't just consider animals and humans. We've got to add plants too, and fish, and ecosystems. And so everything in the world is included in the One Health concept, and that will enable the Director General of WHO to make rules about everything in the world that exists in an ecosystem, if he or she wishes. But this is all based on the fact that you can actually plan effectively for a pandemic, but nobody ever has, despite how much they've spent. The United States has spent about roughly $150 to $200 billion on pandemic planning since the anthrax letters in 2001. And when this pandemic struck, what did we have? We didn't have masks, we didn't have gowns, we didn't have ventilators, we didn't have gloves, we had no drugs, no vaccines, no monoclonal antibodies. We had nothing, not even for our healthcare workers, because the people running the show didn't care. All they wanted to do was spend money and give contracts to their friends. So there'd been a lot of contracts. Unfortunately, though, these concepts are defunct, but they are so, they provide so much money to so many people, sort of like the NIAID, Fauci's agency, did. They have led to a huge industry of pandemic planning and biodefense, not only in the US, but around the world. And therefore, many, many organizations support this because they benefit from it. And that includes the WHO, the House Democrats in the US, the G20, and an organization formed by the WHO and the World Bank called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. And they all demand more surveillance, more money, and the imposition of this One Health concept. There are 3 articles with URLs where you can go and learn more about this. Sweden, unfortunately, seems to have bought into the whole thing. They like that broad approach to health. They like Agenda 2030, and they are all in on sustainable consumption. Sweden has been a top contributor to the WHO. It's number 19, even though it's one of the less populated countries in the world. But not only that, in terms of the WHO created this new organization, the ACT Accelerator. So on top of that, 90-something thousand to WHO directly, Sweden gave last year $300 million to help develop new pandemic drugs and vaccines. Do we need them? No. Why don't they just let us have the hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, ivermectin, vitamin C? So regarding physician discipline, what I found is that my medical board and others are actually completely unfamiliar with the statutes that determine how they are supposed to operate. And there's a reason for that. Of course, bureaucrats like to have power and operate the way they want to, but there have been no restrictions, because when they go after a doctor's license, the doctor only wants one thing: they want the license back, or they don't want it taken away. So the doctors and the doctors' lawyers have not been challenging them on the basis that they're performing unconstitutionally, both according to my state's constitution and federal. So it's really important for doctors to learn what the real rules are, and then to force the boards to apply them, or at least try to, which is what I'm doing in my hearing. My next hearing day is the 31st of January. It'll be broadcast by Children's Health Defense and the Epoch Times. It starts 9 a.m. in the US, which would be 3 p.m. here, and I invite you to watch.